My friends, let us consider the act of prayer not as a comfort, but as a perilous journey, a fire that consumes. To truly pray is to risk everything you hold dear, to place your soul on an altar and watch as the flames consume it. Prayer, if it is honest, will destroy you. Your spirit will be your life, because it will destroy your spirit and place life in the fear of death in many ways, every single day. But what does this destruction mean? Is it a tearing down or a tearing apart? Both. In prayer we confront the truth about ourselves, the truth we spend much of our lives avoiding. We wear masks of confidence, self-reliance and pride. But in prayer, the mask is stripped away. You stand exposed, not as the person you pretend to be, but as the frail, flawed creature you are. That is the first destruction. Prayer does more than reveal, it dismantles. It lays siege to the fortress of false idols we build around our hearts. It burns away our dependence on the fleeting pleasures of this world, leaving us face to face with the eternal. And it is a frightening thing to be left with nothing but God, for He does not settle for fragments. He demands the whole. You will find as you pray that you cannot approach God with a divided heart. Pride, that ancient vice, will resist, clinging to its throne. But prayer will root it out. It will expose every hidden corner of arrogance and self-importance and will not stop until they are reduced to ash. Prayer humbles because it calls us to surrender, and surrender feels like defeat. But in this destruction lies a strange and glorious truth. The fire that destroys also purifies. When prayer tears down the ego, it makes room for grace. When it dismantles the false self, it allows the true self to emerge. What feels like ruin is, in fact, rebirth. And so, I tell you, do not fear the destruction that prayer brings. Embrace it. For it is in losing yourself that you are found, and it is in dying to yourself that you truly live. Prayer will destroy you, yes, but only so that something better may rise from the ashes. In the end, the paradox is clear. The destruction of prayer is the beginning of life. Prayer is often seen as a quiet, comforting ritual, a place where we seek solace, ask for blessings, or express gratitude. But to stop there is to misunderstand its true nature. Prayer is not merely a safe haven, it is a paradox. It is an act that draws us closer to the divine while simultaneously unraveling the illusions we hold about ourselves. It comforts, yes, but only after it confronts. It builds, but only after it is torn down. In this, prayer is not a gentle exercise, but a profound and often unsettling act. It is the fire that purifies, the chisel that shapes, and the storm that clears the path. When we pray earnestly, we open ourselves to truths we would rather avoid. We approach with words carefully chosen, yet, in the presence of the divine, these words often falter. What we intend to say is laid bare alongside what we truly mean. In this moment, prayer exposes us, not to God, for He already knows, but to ourselves. We begin to see how shallow our petitions sometimes are, how self-serving our motives can be, and how far our hearts wander from what is right. The paradox lies in the fact that, while prayer is meant to bring us peace, it first unsettles us. It forces us to acknowledge the disparity between who we are and who we were created to be. In prayer, the ego finds itself under siege. The very act of kneeling, literal or figurative, is an admission of dependence. It is an acknowledgement that we are not the masters of our fate, despite the illusions we work so hard to maintain. The proud heart resists this acknowledgement, clinging to its autonomy, but prayer insists. It whispers, then demands, surrender. This is not a comfortable process. To release the reins of control and admit our need is, for many, a kind of dying. The paradox deepens here, for while prayer may seem to strip us of power, it is only in this surrender that we begin to tap into a power far greater than our own. Prayer also dismantles our attachments to the temporary and the superficial. When we pray sincerely, we are invited to turn our focus from the immediate to the eternal. This shift is not easy. We are creatures of habit, clinging to the tangible comforts of the world around us, status, possessions, relationships, even our own ambitions. Prayer, however, acts as a mirror, reflecting back the fragility of these things. It reminds us that, no matter how tightly we grip them, they cannot last. This realization can feel like a kind of loss, as if prayer is taking something from us, but in reality, it is setting us free. What makes prayer so transformative is that it meets us where we are, but does not leave us there. It calls us higher, deeper, further. Yet, to ascend to these heights, we must first let go of the weights that hold us down. This is the paradox. In prayer, we lose in order to gain. We are broken in order to be made whole. We are emptied in order to be filled. The destruction is not the end, but the means. Through prayer, we come to see that destruction and grace are not opposites, but partners. The same fire that burns also illuminates. The same storm that uproots also clears the way for new growth. Prayer forces us to wrestle with this reality, to embrace the discomfort of change, and to trust that what feels like loss is, in fact, the first step toward true abundance. Thus, the paradox of prayer is one of the great mysteries of life. It unsettles us so that we might find peace. It humbles us so that we might be lifted up. And though it may destroy the false self we cling to, it does so to make room for the person we were always meant to become. Prayer is not a passive act. It is a sacred confrontation, a divine invitation to be remade. And in its paradox, we discover its power. When we come to prayer with sincerity, we are engaging in something far more profound than merely speaking words into the void. Prayer, when practiced honestly, becomes a confrontation, a mirror held up to the soul, revealing the parts of ourselves we would rather not see. It is not the comforting act we often imagine, but a deeply disquieting experience. Isolation in prayer, we do not just encounter God, we encounter ourselves, stripped of pretense, and this confrontation is both humbling and transformative. The nature of human beings is to curate their identities, carefully constructing facades to present to the world. We define ourselves by our achievements, relationships, and appearances. We rehearse our lines and polish our performances, ensuring that we project confidence, capability, and control. But the space of prayer allows no room for such pretense. There, in the quiet, our curated selves crumble, and we are faced with the reality of who we are, our fears, flaws, doubts, and weaknesses laid bare. This unmasking can be deeply uncomfortable. It is easier to live in the illusion that we are as good as the image we present to others. But in prayer there is no audience to impress, no applause to earn. There is only God, who sees beyond the surface and into the depths of our hearts. And what He reveals to us in these moments is often startling. We see our pride, cloaked in the guise of humility. We see our selfishness, dressed up as generosity. We see the ways we fall short, even when we convince ourselves we are succeeding. This confrontation is not meant to condemn, but to heal. It is an act of grace, though it may not feel like one at first. To see ourselves as we truly are is to experience a kind of undoing. It can feel like losing something essential, like being exposed or undone. But this loss is necessary, for only when we acknowledge our brokenness can we begin to be made whole. In this process, prayer becomes a crucible. It refines us by forcing us to face truths that we would rather avoid. It calls us to stop excusing our behavior, to stop justifying our flaws, and to stop hiding from the reality of our condition. This is a painful process, for it involves the death of illusions we hold dear, but it is also a liberating one. To see ourselves clearly is to take the first step toward becoming who we are meant to be. Prayer does not leave us in this state of exposure. While it begins with confrontation, it ends with transformation. Once we have faced the truth about ourselves, we are invited to offer it up to God, not in shame, but in trust. We come to understand that the very flaws and weaknesses we try to hide are the places where grace can work most powerfully. In our acknowledgement of need, we create space for God's strength. In our confession of failure, we make room for His forgiveness. This process is not instantaneous. Confronting the true self is not a single moment, but a continual journey. Each time we come to prayer, we peel back another layer, uncover another truth, face another challenge. And with each step, we grow. We learn to be honest, not just with God, but with ourselves. We learn to let go of the masks and to live more authentically. We learn that the self we worked so hard to create was never the self we were meant to be. In this way, prayer becomes both a mirror and a guide. It shows us who we are and points us toward who we could be. It confronts us with our failures, but also with the hope of redemption. It reveals our brokenness, but also the possibility of wholeness. To confront the true self in prayer is a daunting task, but it is also a gift. For in facing the truth, we are set free, not to remain as we are, but to become all that we were created to be. Prayer, when approached with honesty and humility, does not leave our hearts untouched. It is not merely a moment of quiet reflection or a spiritual exercise meant to affirm our current state. Instead, prayer acts as a refining fire, consuming everything that stands between us and God. Chief among these barriers are the false idols we cling to, those things we elevate above their rightful place, mistakenly believing they will bring us meaning, security, or fulfillment. The destruction of these idols is one of prayer's most profound works, though it is often a painful process. Human beings have always been drawn to idols. In ancient times they were fashioned from stone or wood, objects of worship meant to control the forces of nature or secure blessings. Today our idols are rarely so obvious, but they are no less real. They take the form of wealth, power, relationships, careers, appearances, or even personal achievements. These are not inherently bad things, but when they occupy the throne of our hearts, they become obstacles to true spiritual growth. Prayer confronts these idols not with violence but with truth. In the presence of God, the worthlessness of our false gods is revealed. The wealth we chase is shown to be fleeting. The power we seek is revealed as hollow. The relationships we idolize, though precious, are incapable of fulfilling the deepest longings of our souls. Prayer strips away the illusions that these things can satisfy us, leaving us face to face with their limitations. This confrontation is not comfortable. We resist letting go of our idols because we have invested so much in them. We tell ourselves they are essential to our happiness or identity. Yet, as we pray, we begin to sense the weight of these attachments. We see how they consume our energy, distort our priorities, and leave us perpetually unsatisfied. We may even find ourselves defending them in prayer, rationalizing why we need them, but God in His mercy continues to nudge us toward surrender. The destruction of idols in prayer often feels like loss because it is, in a sense, a kind of death. To let go of the things we have clung to for security is to step into uncertainty. It is to admit that we cannot control our lives as much as we would like to believe. This can be terrifying, for it feels as though the very foundation of our existence is being shaken. But in truth, it is not the foundation being destroyed, but the sand upon which we have built. This act of surrender is where the true work of prayer begins. As we release our idols, we create space in our hearts for God to fill. What was once occupied by the pursuit of wealth, status, or other fleeting desires is now open to the presence of the Eternal. In this sense, the destruction of idols is not an act of divine cruelty, but of divine kindness. God takes away what cannot satisfy to give us what truly can. This process also reorients our perspective. As our idols are stripped away, we begin to see the things of this world in their proper context. Wealth becomes a tool, not an end. Power becomes a responsibility, not an identity. Relationships are cherished, but not worshipped. Prayer teaches us to hold these things loosely, recognizing that they are gifts to be stewarded rather than gods to be served. The destruction of false idols through prayer is not an end but a beginning. It is the starting point for a deeper, freer, and more authentic relationship with God. As painful as it may be to let go, what we gain in return is far greater. We gain clarity, peace, and the joy of knowing that our lives are anchored in something unshakable. And so, though it may feel like ruin, the destruction of idols is ultimately a work of grace. It frees us from the tyranny of lesser things and restores our hearts to their true purpose, to love and serve the one who alone is worthy of worship. In prayer, the false gods fall, and the true God reigns. The imagery of fire often stirs a sense of awe and trepidation, and it is no wonder that fire has long been a symbol of God's transformative power. Fire is both destructive and purifying, consuming what is temporary, while refining what is eternal. When we speak of God's transformative fire, we refer to a divine process that burns away the impurities of our hearts, reshapes us in His image, and prepares us for the life we were created to live. This fire, while painful, is an expression of God's deep love, as it works not to harm us, but to bring us to our truest selves. To encounter God's transformative fire is to stand in the presence of holiness. Holiness is not merely a distant ideal, but a consuming reality. It exposes everything in us that does not belong. Our selfishness, pride, fears, and hidden sins. These things, which we often dismiss or justify, cannot endure in the light of His presence. Prayer is one of the places where we are most exposed to this fire. When we come before God, we bring not just our words but also our hearts, and in His presence those hearts are laid bare. The initial experience of God's fire can feel overwhelming. It is no small thing to realize how far short we fall of His glory. The parts of ourselves we've hidden away, the habits we've clung to, and the attachments we've justified are suddenly revealed for what they are. Weights that keep us from living in the fullness of His grace. The fire begins its work here, not in condemnation, but in love. For God does not reveal these things to shame us, but to free us. He is not content to leave us in our brokenness when He knows we are capable of so much more. This process, however, is not without pain. To be refined by fire is to endure a kind of dying, the death of the self we have created in place of the self God intended. It is the death of pride, as we are forced to confront the reality of our limitations and failures. It is the death of control, as we relinquish the illusion that we can navigate life on our own terms. And it is a death of comfort, as we let go of the attachments and habits that, while familiar, do not lead us closer to God. Yet in this dying, something extraordinary happens. The fire that destroys also purifies. It does not merely consume, it transforms. As we surrender to God's work in us, we begin to see the emergence of something new, a heart that is softer, more humble, and more aligned with His purposes. The impurities that once clouded our vision are burned away, and we begin to see ourselves and the world around us with greater clarity. This transformation is not instantaneous. Fire works over time, and the process of being shaped by God's hands is ongoing. There are moments of resistance where we may recoil from the heat, unwilling to let go of what we have known. But in His patience, God continues to work, drawing us back to the fire, not as punishment, but as preparation. Each time we return, we are changed a little more, becoming increasingly the people we were created to be. What makes this transformation so remarkable is that it does not leave us diminished, but enlarged. The fire burns away only what is false, leaving behind what is real and eternal. It refines our character, deepens our faith, and strengthens our capacity to love. Through this fire, we are not destroyed but renewed, emerging not as lesser versions of ourselves, but as reflections of God's image. God's transformative fire, then, is a gift, though it is one we may not always welcome. It calls us to endure discomfort and to embrace the unknown. Yet it is in this fire that we find life. For what is burned away is not who we are, but who we were never meant to be. The ego is a formidable force within us, often masquerading as confidence, control, or strength. It thrives on the illusion of self-sufficiency, convincing us that we are the center of the universe and that our worth is tied to our achievements, possessions, or how others perceive us. Yet the spiritual life, and prayer in particular, poses a direct challenge to the ego. Prayer calls for humility, surrender, and an acknowledgement of dependence on something greater than ourselves. In this confrontation, the ego begins to crumble, and while its end can feel like a loss, it is the doorway to true freedom and transformation. So how may we leave the world of transcendence and into the world of real serenity? The ego resists prayer because prayer demands honesty. The ego thrives on stories we tell ourselves, that we are in control, that we deserve recognition, and that we can handle life on our terms. Prayer disrupts these narratives. When we step into prayer, we step into the presence of truth, and that truth is humbling. We see our limitations, our failures, and the ways we fall short. For the ego, which thrives on pride, this exposure feels like an attack. It scrambles to protect itself, deflecting blame, justifying actions, or retreating into denial. But in the sacred space of prayer, these defenses cannot hold. This exposure of the ego is not an act of cruelty, but of love. God does not seek to humiliate us, but to free us. The ego, though it promises strength, is a prison. It traps us in a cycle of comparison, fear, and striving, convincing us that we must earn our worth through constant performance. Prayer interrupts this cycle, reminding us that our worth is not something we create, but something we receive. To let go of the ego is to step out of this exhausting cycle and into the rest and peace that come from knowing we are loved as we are, not as we pretend to be. Letting go of the ego, however, is not easy. It feels like dying because, in a sense, it is. The ego clings tightly to its illusions of control and self-importance, and surrendering these feels like stepping into the unknown. We fear that if we let go, we will lose ourselves. But the paradox of the spiritual life is that in losing ourselves, we are truly found. And the chance of the spiritual life is that in losing ourselves, we are truly found. The end of the ego is not the end of our identity, but the beginning of our true identity. One rooted not in what we achieve or possess, but in who we are as children of God. As the ego diminishes, a remarkable transformation begins. The need to prove ourselves gives way to a quiet confidence that comes from knowing we are enough. The compulsion to control others and circumstances is replaced by trust in God's wisdom and timing. The constant comparison with others fades, replaced by a sense of gratitude for who we are and a genuine celebration of others' gifts. In the absence of the ego's demands, we find the freedom to love more deeply, to serve without seeking recognition, and to live with a sense of purpose that is not tied to our own glory, but to something far greater. Prayer is the crucible where this transformation takes place. Each time we come to prayer, we are invited to lay down the ego and to step into humility. This does not mean belittling ourselves or denying our worth. On the contrary, humility is about seeing ourselves rightly as deeply loved, but not the center of the story. It is about acknowledging our need for God and opening ourselves to His grace. The end of the ego is not an event but a journey. It is a daily process of surrender, a continual letting go of the false self so that the true self can emerge. There will be moments of resistance, times when the ego reasserts itself, whispering that we must hold on to control or seek validation. But as we persist in prayer, we find that these moments become less frequent and less compelling. We learn to trust that the letting go, though difficult, leads to light. In the end, the death of the ego is not a loss, but a liberation. It frees us to live not for ourselves, but for the one who created us, and in doing so, we discover a joy and peace that the ego could never provide. Surrender is one of the most profound and difficult acts in the spiritual journey. It requires us to loosen our grip on the things we hold most tightly, our desires, plans, control, and even our identity. To surrender is to trust God with every part of our lives, even when we do not understand His purposes or see where He is leading us. This act is not without cost. It demands the relinquishing of illusions, the breaking of pride, and the courage to walk into the unknown. Yet while the cost of surrender is significant, the life it offers in return is infinitely greater. The first cost of surrender is the relinquishing of control. As human beings, we crave control. We carefully plan our days, map out our futures, and work to ensure that everything aligns with our expectations. We cling to the belief that we can shape our lives through sheer effort and determination. But surrender requires us to release this illusion. It asks us to admit that we are not and cannot be the masters of our fate. This is a difficult admission, for it strikes at the very heart of our independence. To surrender control feels like stepping into uncertainty, and uncertainty is uncomfortable. Another cost of surrender is the willingness to let go of our attachments. We all have things we hold dear: relationships, ambitions, possessions, or status. While these are not inherently bad, they can become obstacles when they take precedence over God. Surrender calls us to examine our hearts and identify the things we cling to most tightly. It asks us to place these things in God's hands, trusting that He knows what is best for us. This is not an easy task. It feels risky, even painful, to release the things we value. Yet, surrender is not about losing what we love, but about trusting that God's plans for us are greater than our own. Surrender also demands the breaking of pride. Pride tells us we are self-sufficient, that we can navigate life on our terms. It resists the idea of dependence, viewing it as weakness. But true surrender cannot coexist with pride. It requires humility, the acknowledgement that we are not enough on our own and that we need God's grace to guide us. This humility is costly because it feels like a loss of dignity, but in truth, it is the path to freedom. In laying down our pride, we find the strength and peace that only come from trusting in something greater than ourselves. So, whilst relinquishing the path and leaving the world to go on its own, perhaps the greatest cost of surrender is the death of the self we have created. Over time, we construct an identity based on our achievements, roles, and the expectations of others. We define ourselves by what we do, what we have, or how we are perceived. Surrender requires us to let go of this false self and to embrace our true identity as God's children. This can feel like stepping into emptiness, as if we are losing the very core of who we are. But in this emptying, we make room for something far more authentic, a life grounded not in what we achieve, but in who we were created to be. The cost of surrender is undeniable, and the process can feel like a series of small deaths. Yet, it is through this very surrender that we find life. When we release control, we discover the peace of trusting in God's sovereignty. When we let go of attachments, we open ourselves to blessings far greater than we could have imagined. When we lay down our pride, we find the strength to walk in humility and grace. And when we let go of the false self, we step into the freedom of living as our truest selves. Surrender does not mean passivity or defeat. It is not an abandonment of effort or a resignation to fate.